Boulder, just below the Flatirons, actually well below just the base of Flagstaff.
Okay.
All right. So,
Yeah, so Rachel, yes, I'll let you take the floor.
All right, great. Well, thanks everybody. So as you may or may not know, I'm an associate professor in the sociology department at CU, and my research, generally speaking, I'm interested in issues of gender and religion and culture and how sort of globalization is affecting those things. And most of my research has been in Indonesia. So that's what I'll be talking about today. So I'm just gonna start sharing my screen. And all right, can everybody see? All right,
yes,
good.
Yes.
So my talk today is on divorce, Islam, and women's empowerment in Indonesia. And, oops, why is it not? Let's see. There we go. Okay, so just for those who are not very familiar with Indonesia, it's an archipelago in Southeast Asia, just sort of in between Malaysia and Australia. It consists actually of 13,000 islands, so it's very ethnically and linguistically diverse, but the most heavily populated islands are Sumatra and Java. And as I'll talk about, Java is where the capital, Jakarta, is, and that's where the biggest cities are, and that's where I do most of my research. So just a few key facts to start off with. By population, Indonesia is the world's 4th largest country. So just behind India, China, and the US. And it is also the country with the world's largest Muslim population. So 90% of its population is Muslim. What many people in the United States may not know is that Indonesia has been a democracy since 1998. And it's really considered one of the most successful majority Muslim democracies. So the government is not an Islamic government. They do recognize 6 official religions. And certainly, as I'll talk about, Islam, because it's very much the majority religion, it does play a very important role in public life. But the constitution is a secular constitution. Now, like many other majority Muslim societies, Indonesia has also undergone what's known as an Islamic revival. Islam came to Indonesia sort of gradually over a period of centuries, starting in around the 13th century. And by the time the Dutch colonists arrived in the 1600s, it was already majority Muslim. But so, you know, it took a couple centuries, but it is very deeply rooted there. However, the way people sort of thought of themselves and practiced Islam was somewhat different, I think, and has gone through a lot of changes. And so, you know, for example, in the past, if you went back, you know, in time 50 years ago, you know, there were a lot of people who certainly being Muslim was very important to them, and they would fast for the really important holidays like Ramadan, but they didn't necessarily pray 5 times a day or always abstain from alcohol or some of these other practices that are, you know, considered now important to Islam. And so there's been a big change since the 1990s all over the world, where a lot of Muslims have become sort of more orthodox in their practice, and it's become a more important part of their kind of individual identity. And the religion has taken on kind of a larger role in social life and politics as well. So I started doing research on Indonesia in 2002. I was interested in it at that time. I was still a graduate student, and I was interested in women's movements and women's activism. And I thought Indonesia would be a particularly interesting place to study this because it was sort of just really in the initial processes of democratization at that time. A lot of things were still very much in flux. but there was a very dynamic women's movement. So I initially started studying that and then became kind of aware of the fact that there were also a lot of kind of specifically Muslim women's groups, and I became very, very interested in that. So my first book was a study of 4 different women's activist organizations. And women's activism there really runs the spectrum from very conservative to very liberal. But sort of in the broad middle, there are a lot of women's rights activists who are creatively combining Islam and feminism. And so that really became the focus of my book. So for example, there were activists who were arguing for tightening restrictions on polygamy or for liberalizing abortion laws. And the way they made these arguments was through sort of innovative readings of the Quran and other sort of religious texts. So they were kind of reinterpreting Islamic theology to be able to argue for these kind of more egalitarian changes. And so Indonesia, I think over the past 20 years has become known for that. It's become known as one of the Muslim countries that has a very active women's rights movement, and then also has this sort of ability that you don't see in all that many places to kind of, for activists to really combine Islam and feminism in these kind of unique ways. So divorce, after my book came out, I became interested in divorce really just through talking to friends and acquaintances. And they kept saying to me, you know, divorce is what's happening. Like everybody's getting divorced now, you should study that. So I did. Just to sort of give you a little bit of background on this. So Islam is very different from Christianity, say, in that Islam has, as a religion, it has a large body of jurisprudence, which mainly applies to family issues, marriage, divorce, custody of children, and inheritance. So in most majority Muslim countries, and even in some countries that have like a significant Muslim minority, you have usually special Islamic courts for family law. And so in a country like Indonesia, and this is true in a number of other majority Muslim countries, you'll often have both a secular court system that deals with like criminal law, and an Islamic court system that deals with family law. So in Islamic law, of course, it's worth recognizing that it's sort of a diverse body of jurisprudence. There are different schools of thought within Islamic law, for example. And so you find that different schools sort of predominate in different parts of the world. So in certain parts of the Middle East, particularly the Saudi Peninsula, you have one of the most conservative versions of Islamic law that tends to predominate. In parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, you have one of the sort of more liberal schools of Islamic law that tends to predominate. But overall, all of these different interpretations of Islamic law, generally speaking, they do have some commonalities. And they tend to institutionalize a particular vision of marriage in which the woman is playing the role of wife and mother, the husband is playing the role of breadwinner and family leader. So scholars call this the obedience and support paradigm, because this is written into some of the versions of Islamic law, where the wife is supposed to obey her husband in return for him supporting the family financially. Overall, it's also the case that Islamic law tends to disadvantage women in divorces. In many countries, it's actually quite difficult for women to seek divorces on their own, whereas it's very easy for men to seek divorces. However, this is changing a lot, and in the past 20 years or so, there's been a global movement of Muslim women activists who are really focusing on changing Islamic law as it's institutionalized in different countries to give women greater rights in marriage and divorce. So there have been some really interesting progressive reforms to Islamic family laws in places like Morocco, Turkey, Egypt, and Malaysia. So in Indonesia, part of the reason I'm really interested in divorce is that marriage and divorce laws have a really crucial impact on women's status and empowerment. We know that, if we go back a century in this country, for example, there were very restrictive laws on divorce and child custody, where women were really disempowered in that process. It was difficult for women to have grounds for divorce. They often lost custody of their children if they sought a divorce, right? And so it was very much part of the feminist movement in this country to have those kinds of laws changed to give women more equal status. So that's, I think, the reason why I think it's useful to study marriage and divorce laws in these different contexts. Now, in Indonesia, divorce was actually quite low in the 1980s and 1990s, especially among the middle class. At that time, it was really kind of stigmatized. But researchers began to see the rate rise starting right around 2000. So perhaps not coincidentally, quite soon after the country began to democratize. So it's certainly, the divorce rates there are nothing like they are in the United States. But there has been kind of a slow and gradual continuing rise in divorce in the last 20 years, with a majority of divorce cases in the Islamic courts being initiated by women. It's about 70% at this point initiated by women. Now, much of this, I think, also relates to the fact that Indonesia only kind of formalized its Islamic court system in 1991. So prior to that, there were Islamic courts, but they operated in a sort of informal way. And in 1991, the government finally formalized this court system and gave it jurisdiction over Muslim marriage and divorces. And as part of doing this, the state created its own version of Islamic law, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and which applies to these Islamic courts. Non-Muslims in Indonesia, and that's about 10% of the population, and in certain areas, non-Muslims may predominate, they go through just secular state courts, but Muslims have to go through the Islamic courts. So the questions that I began with when I started this research was really just sort of the basic question of why are Indonesian women increasingly likely to divorce? And what does this rise in divorce tell us about changes in marriage and gender among Indonesian Muslims? And that, that building that you can see there is one of the Islamic courts where I did some research. So I did research over several summers in 2 cities on Java, Malang and Yogyakarta. Both of these cities are around 500,000 in population, so they're kind of mid-sized cities. I interviewed 52 men and women who were divorced or in the process of divorce. Also interviewed Islamic court judges, and was able to get into the actual courtrooms to do observations as well. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of what these cities look like. So these are kind of relatively prosperous cities. Both of them are home to several universities. So they're pretty middle-class population. And flourishing small business sectors and so on. And they've both grown a lot in population in the past 20 to 30 years. So the interviews that I did, I really started, I've been studying Indonesia since 2002, as I said, but I have kind of deeper roots there in that I spent a year there in 1990 as a high school exchange student. So, I have a lot of strong connections there, and I started, how do you find divorced people? Well, I kind of started with my own social networks and talked to my friends and colleagues and asked them to help me find, divorced folks who would be willing to be interviewed. And then when I did what's called snowball sampling, where each time I interviewed somebody, I would then ask them if they knew anybody else that I could interview. So what happens with that is that it can be a good way to find people, but it does sort of kind of give you a particular network of people. So the people that I interviewed were pretty overwhelmingly middle-class professionals, and even up to sort of upper middle class, which I think reflects, who my friends and acquaintances are in Indonesia. But I still think that this group of people gives us some, I think, very useful insights into what's going on more broadly. So they tended to be in their 20s, 30s, 40s. In most of these cases, the divorce was initiated by the wife. I put the incomes here. It's not very meaningful in the US context, but this is an income that would put you in the middle to upper middle class in the US. As you can see, 61% have some education beyond high school, which is very unusual for Indonesia, where generally speaking, less than 10% of the population would normally have that kind of education. So it's an unusually highly educated group of people. But I did certainly have some folks who were high school graduates or less as well. And actually that was almost 40% of the people I interviewed. So just to talk a little bit about Indonesia's Islamic family law. So Indonesia has had since 1974, they have a national law that governs marriage and divorce. So that's what's used in the secular court system. And that's actually seen as sort of the overall law. So the compilation of Islamic law is based on that law. It's not actually very different, and everything in the compilation of Islamic law has to be compatible with the national marriage law. Really the difference between them is mostly language. I've read through both of them quite carefully, and it's mostly the sort of language that they use. So Indonesia's version of Islamic family law, I can definitely say it's more liberal than most interpretations of Islamic law around the world. It gives women very broad rights to divorce. They can divorce for pretty much any reason they want to, including, they have a sort of general catch-all category of like disharmony in the family. So it's not hard for women to find grounds for divorce, and they have the same grounds as men do. Women also get much more custody rights under Indonesian Islamic law than elsewhere. So most Muslim family laws tend to give custody of children to the husband's family, the husband or his family. In Indonesia, wives get automatic custody of children under 12. And then children over the age of 12 get to decide which parent they want to have custody. And it seems to usually be with the mother. There are some minor ways in which women are somewhat financially disadvantaged if they are the ones who sue for divorce. Mainly what that is that if the husband sues for divorce, there are a lot of different kinds of payments that he owes to the wife, various forms of alimony and so on, and child support. If she is the one who sues, she's only entitled to child support and not some of the other kinds of payments. However, that does not seem to be a disincentive, at least for the women I interviewed. Indonesia was also the first country to appoint women as judges in Islamic courts. This is something that only became somewhat more common in some of the other majority Muslim countries in the last 20 years. So Indonesia's been doing it for a lot longer. About 15 to 20% of their Islamic court judges are women. And so overall, my reading of the Islamic family law is that more so than sort of the traditional kinds of Islamic law that are used in places like Egypt. The Indonesian version tends to reflect ideals such as mutual love and cooperation between spouses. That language is very much present in the Indonesian text, whereas most other Islamic family law is very kind of contractually oriented and sort of sees this kind of wife and husband in terms of like, you know, she provides X and he provides Y. But I would say overall, the Indonesian Islamic family law is not egalitarian. And so just because it sort of enshrines ideals of mutual love doesn't mean that it's egalitarian. And it still very much has this ideal of husband, breadwinner, and, you know, wife as caretaker of the children. That is, I should say, also in the secular marriage law as well. All right, so turning to some of the actual research that I did and what I found, I think one of the consistent themes from, and particularly the women that I interviewed, was that there are a number of things that they just considered what I call deal breakers in a relationship. And these were sort of things that really were kind of the main cause of them getting divorced. Things like infidelity, domestic violence, emotional abuse, lack of love, or sort of having a more mutual relationship, or the husband not being willing to try to support his family or give money to his wife, and then sometimes immoral behavior, often gambling or drug use. That usually came along with several of the other issues. So these were the things that women tended to, you know, most commonly cite as the reasons for wanting to divorce their husbands. So this woman, this is a fairly long quote, but I think this is somewhat of a fairly typical situation where this was quite a young woman. They didn't yet have children. You know, their marriage kind of started out happy and then just seemed to sort of disintegrate, particularly around issues of whether she could work or not. And I guess initially she had worked before she was married. When they got married, he asked her to stop working and said that he would support her, but then he didn't. And so then she tried to start a small business with him because she wanted to have some income of her own. He ended up taking most of the money from the business and wouldn't give it to her. So, you know, as she says, I consulted with psychologists, religious experts, and so on. And then she said, in this case, from the perspective of religion, it was indeed fatal that my husband didn't want or wasn't able to give me money and took the money for himself. So as she says, the religious leaders supported her in her effort to get a divorce. They felt that he was not living up to his obligations. And in fact, as she said, you know, she tried to get him to pray more frequently, and instead he threw plates at her. And so as she says, finally, I thought, I can't tolerate this. I decided better not to waste my time with a person who can't change. And so I think one of the themes that comes out a lot here is, and I think perhaps it's somewhat counterintuitive, that wives are able to kind of hold their husbands accountable to religious law, right? And so there was a lot going on in here, both him taking money, domestic violence, right? A sort of relationship that wasn't working out. But she was able to get support from, you know, religious experts and leaders in this effort to get out of the marriage. Another theme that was common among the women that I interviewed was ability to leave the marriage and wanting self-fulfillment. So as one woman told me, I used to be fine having a relationship without love, but then I thought about it more. I might not live for a long time. Why do I have to stay in an unhealthy relationship? So women would sometimes, when their relationship, you know, really went downhill and seemed to be staying that way, started thinking, you know, why do I have to stay in this situation? Another woman told me, and this was a fairly pretty low income woman with less than a high school education. She said, well, maybe since some of us can earn money ourselves, so being divorced doesn't actually create financial difficulties. That's how I think. My husband said, you're being so annoying since you got a job. You ignore me since you got a job. And I answered, it's because you made me like this. So there were definitely tensions around, I think, women's working and income earning. And there were definitely some husbands who either wanted their wives not to work, especially once they had children, or were sort of would allow them to work, but were kind of reluctant about it. And, you know, I think a pretty prominent theme was many of these women came to a point where they kind of realized that, well, hey, I can actually earn my own money. I don't need to stay in this relationship. And I initially thought that that was really limited. That was partly because I was interviewing a lot of college educated women, right? And since college education is still not that common in Indonesia, you know, having that kind of education does give you a lot more options in the job market. But when I went back through the interviews, I found that this was a consistent theme even among the women who were high school graduates or less. And, you know, even they felt like, you know, they could find ways to support themselves. Certainly one of the issues that was key for a lot of them was family support. And, you know, many of them, especially in the first year or so after the divorce, got help from their families. Sometimes moving back in for them, sometimes, you know, the grandparents would pay for the kids' schooling, things like that. That was fairly common to have a lot of family support, and that was something I think that surprised me. Another very prominent theme was love and companionship, and a lot of women really feeling like their marriage should be characterized by love and companionship. And if it wasn't, that led them to really question it. And so like one woman was talking about how her husband never really helped out and did anything at home. And she said, one night I asked for him to give our child a bath because I was coming home late, but he wouldn't do it. It had to be me. And my husband just hung out with his friends. He didn't even care that I came home. I was tired of it. It had to be both of us. And so she kind of went on about how she felt like the relationship had to be, you know, both of them kind of working together in the house. Another woman said in the mediation process, and this was in the Islamic courts, people have to go through this mediation process first before they can progress to the divorce. And so initially she thought she wanted to stay married, and then she realized through that process, and apparently this process doesn't seem to work very well, but she said, I want to live better. I want to find a better person. I mean that he doesn't need to be handsome or rich. The important thing is that he will love me forever. And all this time I didn't get anything like that from Tommy, so I was hurt. So ironically, this mediation process that was meant to, you know, kind of repair the marriages, actually in her case and in many of the others that I talked to, resulted in her realizing that she didn't have the level of love and respect in this marriage that she wanted. So some of my observations from the Islamic courts and the interviews with judges, as I mentioned before, there are, you know, definitely some financial disadvantages that women face, especially if they're the ones that are suing for divorce. But I did not find anyone for whom this was a disincentive. You know, I mean, women kind of noticed this and, you know, were sometimes annoyed by it, but it didn't stop them. On the whole, I found the judges to be quite sympathetic to women. The judges themselves really seem to see marriage as a partnership. They definitely still saw it in terms of those kind of gendered responsibilities. But in practice, they tended to be quite critical of husbands' behavior. So, you know, they felt overwhelmingly, the judges felt that in most of these cases, it was kind of husbands behaving badly, and that, you know, women had the right to divorce such husbands. And the judges sort of saw themselves as holding men accountable to being kind of good breadwinners and good family leaders. And so when there were marriages that had, you know, physical or emotional abuse, especially, but also, you know, infidelity, things like that, you know, they talked about those kinds of marriages as broken. And so the judges that I interviewed said to me that in most cases, they didn't think these marriages were able to be repaired or reconciled, that they were really broken relationships by the time people came to court. And now their task was to sort of help sort it out. So just a picture of me with some of the women judges. And Indonesia, in the past decade or so, there have been some very interesting legal reforms where they're, you know, trying to get more women on the bench. And they're also trying to, they've made some reforms to try to make the courts more accessible to women, kind of lowering the fees for various services and so on, and particularly for low-income women. So certainly what I saw is that women have become very much aware of the courts as a place where they can sort of get the rights that they feel are owed them, especially custody of their children. It is possible in Indonesia. I mean, it's a huge country. And so, you know, you can certainly get divorced informally. You know, you could go to like a local religious leader and they could sort of declare you divorced. It wouldn't be considered valid by the state, but, you know, in your community, that might be considered valid. And so one of the issues is that for a long time, that's what most people have done. And it's really only since those legal reforms in the 1990s that, you know, people have really been going to the court in large numbers to get divorced. And so I think partly what's happened is that the Islamic courts have become known to women as the place to go to make sure that you get your rights. Because if you just go to your local leader, yeah, you might get divorced, but maybe your husband will actually take the kids. But if you go to the court, you know, if they're under 12, you know, you'll be the one that gets custody. And that seemed to be the issue that was most important for the women that I interviewed. You know, in most cases, there wasn't a whole lot of property or assets to split. But what they were interested in was getting custody. So why the rise in divorce? Well, I would say, you know, in large part, it's due to partly to that the Islamic people, have this awareness of the Islamic courts and what you can get by going to them. Also, more women are educated than ever before. Although Indonesia still has a very small kind of overall percentage of people who have a college level education, it's still, they're nationally under 10%. But the percentage of women among those who are enrolled in higher education is now over a third. So, you know, certainly of the people that are college educated, more and more of them are women. And this seems to have gone along with a lot more knowledge of women's rights under Islamic family law. I think this is partly traceable to, there's been kind of a boom in Islamic education at the, you know, for a lot for kids, but then also sort of for adults as well. It's very popular to go to, like, you know, after school Quranic studies and things like this. But I think, you know, certainly if the women that I talked to, it was very clear that they were fairly knowledgeable about the rights that they had under Islamic law, and particularly the rights to divorce and the right to custody and so on. But certainly I also think that there are changing ideas of marriage at work here as well. And I think this is partly what has really changed since the 1980s. And some of the women express this in the interviews. They, you know, I asked some of them, do you think your mom or your grandmother would have gotten divorced in this situation? And a few of them said, yeah, probably. But a lot of them said, no, I think my mom would have just stuck it out, you know, that she considered it her duty and she would have just stuck it out. But, you know, whereas for me, I see it as like, I don't have to be in this kind of marriage. So I think that's been a very important change, is that a lot more women are sort of expressing this idea that marriage should be a partnership, not necessarily 50-50, but certainly, you know, have these characteristics of kind of mutuality, like feeling that it's a team where both people are contributing. And what was, I think, surprising to me was that many of the judges on the Islamic court seemed to agree with that. So I think to end here, I think among the broader implications here, I think certainly the flexibility of Islamic law here, right, is that Indonesia's Islamic law, I think, really looks quite different than many other majority Muslim countries. And I think in this case, Islamic, you know, we hear lots of cases around the world, right, where Islamic law can be very patriarchal. It can really be used to disempower women. But here it's become a way that, you know, many women are able to kind of hold their husbands accountable, and it seems to, and that certainly the courts have definitely made it easier for women to get out of troubled marriages. And I also think that, you know, the laws here, you know, by sort of enshrining this vision of Islamic marriage as one where both partners are contributing, has been able to sort of promote that marriage ideal much more widely. As I mentioned, there have been recent reforms to broaden access to Islamic courts, to provide gender sensitivity trainings to judges. These reflect the efforts of Muslim feminists and other human rights activists in Indonesia. And so I think that given the importance of marriage and divorce for kind of women's lives, right, that this, especially in majority Muslim countries, may be a really crucial strategy for women's rights. Certainly, I think one of the key questions for me is, you know, going forward, and I've talked about this quite a bit with some of my Muslim feminist friends, it is pretty clear that these sort of strict gender roles are embedded in Islamic law, this husband, provider, wife as domestic caregiver. And so I think a big question that remains for, you know, Muslim feminists and others who are trying to reform Islamic law is, can that formulation be changed? I certainly know Muslim feminists who argue that, you know, in their reading of the text, the husband doesn't have to be the provider, that it could be just anyone, whoever wants to be the provider could be the provider for the family. And that doesn't have to be sort of a role that's tied to a specific gender. So that's what some of the Muslim feminists are arguing these days, but that's not yet a very mainstream interpretation. So it remains to be seen sort of how far some of those reform efforts can go. And that's it. Stop there.
Great, thank you, Rachel. I think everybody can unmute themselves if they would like. And we do have some questions in the chat box. Jason has asked, which texts have they used to justify monogamy, and how do they account for the Quran that prescribes polygamy?
So yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's not so much a textual justification of monogamy. What they do is they call for a contextual interpretation of the Quran. So the argument is that, you know, in the Quran, it doesn't prescribe polygamy, it allows it. And so their argument is that, that was considered to be appropriate in the context of 7th century Arabia. But that, if you take a sort of contextual approach to understanding Islam, and if you see it as something that can be updated, and they argue that that's what Allah wants, right? Is for Islam to sort of fit the societies in which it exists. And so they argue that for that, that you need a more updated understanding, and that polygamy is no longer a good fit with the modern world. That's the argument that I see them making in Indonesia. And that really kind of hangs on, in that text in the Quran, it says that the wives have to be treated equally. Mm-hmm. And so the Muslim feminists in Indonesia argue that equal treatment isn't just about being able to financially support wives, but about providing kind of emotional support to wives. And they argue that as it's not humanly possible to provide emotional support to more than one wife. So that's their argument for monogamy. And it's also, I should mention too, that the Indonesian state has its own restrictions on polygamy. So civil servants, for example, have to get special permission from their bosses. And for a man to marry a second wife, he has to go through the Islamic courts and prove that the first wife has consented, and that he can financially support additional wives. So levels of polygamy there are not all that high, actually. It's not all that common. So most of these arguments are sort of theoretical.
Makes sense.
And
a lot of questions.
That's Jason, you had another one. Can Muslims opt to go through the secular courts as well, or are they compelled to use the Islamic ones?
They are compelled to use the Islamic courts, yes, for marriage and divorce. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do they, if they're compelled to use the Islamic ones, do they hear that there's different treatment towards women in the secular courts, and is there some frustration with, well, I'm not getting as good of a deal as a secular woman would be getting?
Not really, because certainly in terms of like allowing people to get a divorce, I would say, if anything, the Islamic courts are like more liberal than the secular courts. It's very easy in practice to get a divorce in the Islamic court. They almost never say no. In terms of the payments, I think really the only difference between the Islamic law and the secular law is actually under the Islamic law, women, if the man divorces, then the woman is entitled to a whole bunch of different payments that she's not entitled to in the secular courts. So some people see the Islamic courts as preferable, actually, because you're more likely to be able to, and there are some, there's some latitude for interpretation and practice. And so that, sometimes some sympathetic judges, even if the woman is suing for divorce, they'll find ways to kind of force her husband to make other kinds of payments to support her. So I don't think people really feel like there's that much difference between the secular and the Islamic courts. I would say actually not that many people use the secular courts for divorce. I was actually originally, I was trying to interview non-Muslims about divorce as well, and I had a very hard time finding them. And I think that was because most of the non-Muslims in the cities where I was doing interviews are either Protestants or Catholics. So Catholics are much less likely to get divorced, right? The Catholic Church in Indonesia is, pretty strongly opposed to divorce. And so, there's no data about, what percentage of Catholics get divorced, but I didn't find any, actually. I'm sure they're there, but, certainly they have to do it without the approval of the church. So that's a big disincentive. I also found that the Protestants there, the Protestant denominations are pretty conservative ones. And they also put pretty strong pressure against divorce in their congregations. So I think I only found 1 or 2 Protestants who were divorced, and they also kind of had to kind of go against the wishes of their religious community. The only other non-Muslim I found was a woman who had converted to Hinduism to marry her husband, who was a Balinese Hindu. So yeah, I think actually, the Islamic courts are really seeing the vast majority of divorce cases, and the other religious communities seem to have lower levels of divorce.
Ed has a question. Do you believe that Indonesia has substantially better societal rights for women than the other Muslim-dominated countries?
I think it depends on what your comparisons are. I think it's easy to forget that when we're talking about majority Muslim countries, we're talking about everything from parts of Eastern Europe to a lot of many parts of the African continent, to the Middle East, to Southeast Asia, all the way to parts of the Philippines. So it's very difficult to generalize. I mean, certainly compared to like the Gulf countries, right? Those are by and large a lot more conservative than Indonesia when it comes to gender. And so, yeah, compared to countries like Saudi Arabia, where you have guardianship for women, where husbands sort of exercise that right over women, or Iran, where you have kind of some similar types of laws in place. I think you could say that Indonesia has better rights, but then you have places like Tunisia or Senegal, where, these are countries with fairly secular governments, and, where you have, certainly strong, good constitutions that protect women's rights, and pretty high representation of women in parliament and in civil society and so on. So, I think Indonesia is sort of comparable to those types of places, Senegal, especially Tunisia, Turkey to some degree, possibly.
So there are a few more questions by some of the same people that have asked questions. So I just want to open it up real quick for anybody else that hasn't been able to ask a question before we move on. Kate or Erica or Tom, any questions?
Can we just ask them directly then?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think this is really interesting. Talk about, I didn't know there was such a thing as really progressive Muslim. Don't really hear about that too much. So I think that's really, really good. So I guess there are 2 parts of, would you say this is like a role model for Muslim countries to follow? It sounds like, they're making a lot of progress, but still have some ways to go, just like we do too, in a lot of ways. Also, how do they deal with, radical Muslims? Is that something that's going on in Indonesia? The Shiites and the who are all fighting everybody, and want to kill, the infidels. I mean that's a fringe element, but in some places it's more pronounced. So so that's basically my questions. And
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought that Indonesia is, a really great example, and I wish that more people know about it. That's part of the reason I've chosen to do research there. I do think it's I think it's somewhat unusual in the way that there are a lot of women activists who really don't see any, who see Islam and feminism as being able to be reconciled with each other, right? Who have a very kind of egalitarian interpretation of Islam that for them can support feminism, can support human rights and so on. And I think these kinds of, activists have been fairly prominent in Indonesia in a way that maybe they haven't been in some other countries. Although they've certainly been influenced, I think, by some kind of progressive Muslim theologians from other parts of the world. particularly from India, from Iran, from some other places. So there is sort of this global network of kind of progressive Islam that I think we don't hear a lot about. But it is around, but I think Indonesia probably is one of the places where it's been more influential. I think part of the reason that people don't know as much about it, I think, you know, Islam, generally speaking, is kind of Middle East centric, right? The narrative is that, you know, Mecca is the heart and soul of the Islamic community around the world. And so, you know, Saudi Arabia has exerted a huge amount of influence on sort of what gets represented as Islam. And so Indonesia gets sort of pushed to the margins in those discussions. So for example, you know, when you go to, if you look at universities and you look at their departments of religious studies and you look at the people who study Islam, it's almost always people who study the Middle East. Rarely people who do research in India or Bangladesh or Malaysia or Indonesia, even though actually a majority of the world's Muslims are in Asia. Even more rare would be to have somebody that studies Islam in Africa, say, even though Africa actually has a growing percentage of the world's Muslims. So I think, you know, partly we just don't hear anything about it because both, you know, sort of the leaders, kind of the, you know, the spiritual leaders of Islam and the Western world's sort of perceptions of Islam tend to center the Middle East and particularly, you know, Egypt and the Gulf countries. I think also it's just, there are some logistical hurdles. Until recently, you know, English wasn't that widely spoken in Indonesia. You know, the country is poorer than many countries in the Middle East. So until fairly recently, there just weren't that many people who had strong English skills. And so their work, you know, is only more recently being translated into English. So it just hasn't kind of gotten very far beyond Indonesia. I think that's starting to change. About the radicals, I mean, yeah, I mean, certainly Indonesia has had problems with that. I mean, I was just starting my dissertation fieldwork when there was a massive bombing in Bali that killed 200 people. And, you know, and I was there for several other bombings that occurred in the ensuing years. And so, you know, Al-Qaeda was very active there, and more recently ISIS has been active. So, you know, they're definitely part of the sort of transnational Islamic radical networks. The Indonesian government, I would say, in the past 15 years especially, has cracked down pretty hard on radicals. I mean, in a way that I think a lot of human rights activists are not particularly happy with. I mean, you know, they shoot people on sight, basically. I mean, it's, you know, they're pretty hardcore. So, you know, I would say that they have kind of suppressed that type of radicalism, I think, to a large degree. I think what's more of an issue is, I would say, you know, sort of more conservative understandings of Islam have become much more widespread. Jason asked a question about the spread of philosophies such as Wahhabism and Salafism, which are these very conservative sort of literalist understandings of Islam. And that has become much, much more widespread in Indonesia. And I think that's more of an issue because the followers of those movements are usually nonviolent. So they're not the people who are carrying out bombings, but they certainly are often kind of pushing for changes that, you know, would certainly drastically alter the country. So far, they haven't had, you know, majority support. They kind of remain a vocal minority. But, you know, those movements do have potential to change things dramatically, and they have in some regions of the country.
I have a comment on that Bali bombing. I think after they researched it, they determined that the people who actually did it were not from Indonesia. They were foreign terrorists that were coming in to strike at the heart of you know, American or Western culture by bombing Western tourists in Bali?
Well, the actual perpetrators were Indonesian, but they were Indonesians who had fought in Afghanistan, several of them, and had become connected up to Al Qaeda. So the funding came from Al Qaeda, but the local perpetrators were Indonesian. And so that's been the case with a number of the bombings that have happened there over the years. Yeah.
So Kate or Erica, do you have any questions before we?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm wondering how Indonesia compares to Turkey. I was in Turkey about 6 years ago, and it seemed really kind of liberal and forward thinking in terms of, you know, there were women with wearing the hijab and women who were not wearing the hijab, just hanging out together, walking down the street, which is really nice to see. And I'm wondering, like, I don't really know if some of them were Muslim versus Christian, or if some of them were Muslim and wearing it and some were Muslim and not wearing it. But I'm wondering if you ever see the same kind of thing in Indonesia, or how you think that compares.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities. I haven't personally been to Turkey, but certainly from what I've read and, you know, friends that I've talked to who study Turkey, there's quite a lot of similarities. I think both of them, you know, in Turkey, you have this legacy of their, you know, first president, Ataturk, who was this secularizer and modernizer, who did not want religion to play a prominent role in public life. And I think to some extent in Indonesia, the first post-independence leader, Sukarno, was somewhat similar to that. So I think, you know, there's some interesting, I think, similar history there. I think, yeah, and then Turkey, like Indonesia, both of them around the same time, around the late 80s, early 90s, started to have you know, the kind of reemergence of Islamic movements, a lot more women starting to wear the veil and so on. So, you know, those were sort of happening around the same time as well. But in Indonesia also, you know, like Turkey, in Indonesia, you know, the veil, nobody's required to wear the veil unless you're at like an Islamic school or in a mosque. And in fact, somewhat similar to Turkey, women actually had to fight for the right to wear the veil, like in workplaces or in secular schools. So that was a, you know, sort of a struggle that happened in the late 80s and early 90s, as it happened in Turkey as well. So yeah, I mean, I think often, you know, a sort of casual visitor to Indonesia, you know, what you would see is I've often talked to casual visitors who are actually don't even realize that it's a majority Muslim country because, you know, you turn on the TV and it's like pop stars gyrating. You know, it feels like a fairly liberal atmosphere. I would say it's less that way, you know, when you get out to more rural areas, but certainly in big cities, you know, you have women who wear veils, women who don't, often in the same family, groups of friends and so on. It's, you know, it's fairly, people are kind of casual about those things. You have people, there are definitely interreligious friendships, a lot of those, you know, in urban areas. So, you know, there's a lot of that. There's a, you know, I would say in most of the urban areas, you know, there's sort of a fairly liberal culture that you can see. You know, you have like a punk scene and, you know, an art scene and things like that going on. You know, there's a pretty wide range of creative expression. And, you know, the media is pretty freewheeling. So it's, you know, it's a fairly democratic atmosphere. But there is, I think, as in Turkey, there's a big difference between the urban areas and the rural areas, right? And the rural areas are much more socially conservative, much more kind of orthodox, which has, you know, I think that's long been the case. I don't think that's actually that much of a change.
That's the case here too.
Yeah, exactly. It has that same kind of cultural divide between the sort of urban cosmopolitan culture and you know, a more conservative rural culture, although with some exceptions. Yeah.
I was in Palu, Sulawesi for the eclipse at 2016, and you know, it's very, very majority Muslim. And when 300 eclipse watchers descended upon the city, they just like closed the city down and had a big parade for us and stuff. But
yeah, it's an extremely welcoming culture.
Yeah.
People are
I'm gonna,
hospitable.
I'm going to share a picture that I took of two girls who were at the eclipse, and you know, they're wearing the head coverings, but they're rocking it. You know, they were very Western and excited to you know, be in contact with this big group of foreigners, and very open, and I was impressed.
And where was this at?
It was Sulawesi is a northern island, and it happened to be where the eclipse was going overhead, but it's kind of the most majority Muslim island as of any of the Indonesian islands, at least was at that time, I heard. So
yeah, I mean, I think Indonesia's, you know, you have, one of the things I really like about it is that you have these amazing juxtapositions. So like, there's a heavy metal band there that's all girls who wear hijab, right, and play heavy metal and sing songs about human rights. So, you know, Indonesia is a place where you find these kind of fascinating juxtapositions.
I had a question. When women do get divorced in Indonesia, do they bring any dishonor onto their family, or how do their original family? How does the original family feel about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think that's something that has really changed. You know, I mean, certainly the scholarship that I've read about, you know, what things were like back in the 70s or 80s, there was a fair amount of informal divorce, particularly among the poor. But among the middle class, it was definitely stigmatized, and families, you know, did not want their daughters to get divorced. They would definitely see that as sort of dishonorable. And so I think that's partly what kept the middle class divorce rate fairly low for a long time. And I think that's what's really changed, because the women I talked to, almost all of them had strong family support. Some of them, in fact, kind of said that like their parents were relieved when they got divorced because they never liked their husband. So yeah, that was very striking. That you know, I'm sure there's still some families where that's the case, but that did not seem to be the case among the majority of the women that I talked to. Now, Indonesia is a little bit different in that, you know, kinship and sort of the structures of families in Java in particular is what anthropologists call bilateral. And what that means is that in a lot of majority Muslim societies, particularly in the Middle East, and this would actually be true for Christians in the Middle East as well, and Jews too, the family structure is patrilineal, meaning that the resources get passed down through the man's family line, and it's his line that is more important in the marriage. So that's why often in somewhere like Egypt, for example, the man is much more likely to get custody in the divorce, right? Because the patrilineal family has the power, and it's that family that's considered very important. But Java and some other parts of Indonesia have this bilateral kinship where both the male and female line are considered equally important. And so women can inherit from their families. They bring property into the marriage often, and under Islamic law, they retain control of their property. So I think that, you know, has contributed to some really important differences in the basic, and I think that's part of the reason that Indonesian Islamic law is more friendly to women than other versions of Islamic law, is because of that kind of basic kinship difference, where women have always sort of had the ability to pass down property and bring property to the marriage. Yeah.
Now, Jason asks, what are the requirements for people to become Islamic judges, and in particular women?
Yeah, so Indonesia has a big state university system, and the state university system is sort of divided into a secular university system and an Islamic university system. And so to become a judge, you have to go to one of the state Islamic universities. I think you're supposed to major in, they have a lot of different majors in those universities, and you're supposed to major in, I think there are only a couple majors that qualify. And then every year the Ministry of Religion puts out a call for applications for judges. And so graduates of those universities who majored in specific disciplines like Quranic exegesis are eligible to apply to become judges. So you go through this application process, and then they put you into a training program, usually for a couple of years, to become a judge.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, so they don't go to like a traditional law school necessarily, although some of them do that as well.
Right. Like if you want to, I can't remember the name of it, but the big Islamic university in Egypt, in Cairo, like I can't remember the name, but yeah, would that count, like, or would that work towards becoming no, you have to go to an Indonesian university?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that would be seen as a plus if you did that. They have like a long running scholarship program with Al-Azhar. So yeah, a lot of people do get their undergrad degree at Al-Azhar, and that's considered very prestigious. But then you would have to come back and go through the Indonesian university. And at least I think maybe if you got like a master's or a PhD at the Indonesian university, you would be eligible. But yeah, you have to have the Indonesian training.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Well, you mentioned the dual linear kind of like family structure. I was just curious, I assume that predates the introduction of Islam, and is it similar in places like the Philippines or other non-Muslim countries in the area?
Yeah, it does long predate Islam, long predates Christianity in the region. That's, the sort of, at least from what, historians and archaeologists tell, that kind of bilateral kinship has been in play. And in some cases, there's actually matrilineal kinship among some groups as well. And so that long predates any of the monotheistic religions. And that tends to characterize other parts of Southeast Asia as well. And so, it's long been thought that that's part of the reason that women in Southeast Asia, have had sort of a more, not necessarily equal, but, a sort of higher status than women in many other regions of the world. So yeah, it's something that Indonesia, shares with like a non-Muslim country like Thailand, for example. Yeah, and also the Philippines.
Nice.
I know from an atheist perspective, when I start hearing about a religious group and hear that they are acknowledging some of the marginalized people in that community and giving rights and choices, and like what you're just talking about, I think is so positive and encouraging. It makes me feel that, well, Islam is not as bad as I thought, kind of thing. But when you hear, terrible, terrorist activity or suppression of women's rights, then you kind of you're harder on that religion, because of how it's treating people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's important to recognize, though, to really think about, was religion necessarily the cause of that oppression, right? Or is it a way that people justify that oppression? And like in the case of parts of South Asia or the Middle East, there's a lot of evidence that, very patriarchal forms of kinship long predate Islam in those regions. So if it wasn't Islam, it would be something else, right, that
Right.
might justify that kind of treatment of women. So, and I think as a social scientist who, I'm an atheist myself, but I'm interested in studying religion as a social force. And, what I see is that it can be used in both very positive and very problematic ways, right? And certainly, there are, obviously I mentioned the terrorism, right? There are very problematic, forms of religion and, in Indonesia. But, many of the activists, I see them as sort of being akin to the way that religion has often been a force for social justice in the US context, right? In the civil rights movement, for example, in the abolitionist movement, where, religion, and religious ideals really helped people to, think about equality, for example, and help give people a sort of language to talk about racial equality and, and as sort of a moral, aspect of life that they wanted. And I see sort of similarities in the Indonesian context as well, where people are able to use religion to give sort of equality and human rights a kind of a moral force.
Jason, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. It's something I was thinking about when you were talking about if people could choose the secular or Islamic courts. I was wondering, are there any laws against apostasy, especially against, or for Islam in particular? And if there are, like, what are the punishments for those?
Indonesia does not have a law against apostasy, so you can change your religion anytime you want. I mean, certainly there's often, family or social pressure against doing that, but it's relatively common. There is a blasphemy law, which is interesting because for a long time, it's been on the books. The Dutch actually originally put that on the books.
Wow.
And it was on the books for years and never used. And it's only sort of become more widely used in the past 20 years or so. And certainly I think, a lot of people have written about this. It seems to sort of reflect efforts to kind of really, sharpen the boundaries of religious communities and particularly Islam and sort of, there's certainly, I think, those who would like to be able to say, this is Islamic, that's not Islamic. And it's usually used to sort of punish, a political figure in some way or other. And so, it's been very controversial. Certainly there, I think has been a lot of protest against the ways blasphemy laws have been used as kind of a political tool. So that's certainly an ongoing concern.
It's kind of hard to have a real apostasy law when you've got 4 very well-established religions in the country. So the standards of one religion really cannot be used to dominate.
Yeah, and that's been, I think one thing that maybe makes Indonesia somewhat different from, say, a place like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, even though Muslims are an overwhelming majority at about 90%. Christians, when you include both Protestants and Catholics, have a pretty strong role nationally, even though their numbers are not that high. They've been politically pretty influential. So quite, quite a few important kind of government ministers and so on have come from Christian backgrounds. The army has always had a lot of Christians. So I think that has been kind of an interesting an important counterbalance, I think, and especially with apostasy, those kinds of laws. So religious conversion is relatively common. I was somewhat surprised when I was doing another study about 7 or 8 years ago about marriage, and I just happened sort of randomly to include a question about whether people had people of other religions in their families. And I was pretty surprised at the high numbers of people that said somebody in their family had married somebody from a different religion. So, I think it is relatively common, although you have to convert. Sort of strangely under the marriage law, people have to be of the same religion. So, if you're married, if you're a Muslim or you're a Christian, somebody's got to convert.
You had mentioned earlier that it seemed like there was a period where Indonesia was more liberal, and then there was like an Islamic wave or revival to where women were asking to be able, or to make it mandatory to wear the hijab in certain places. I don't understand that. I guess that's so interesting to me that women would want that back, that restriction or that rule.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a complicated issue. I would say first, it's not quite right to say Indonesia was more liberal. I mean, it sort of looks like it was superficially more liberal because women weren't wearing veils. But having lived there in 1990, when I was a high school exchange student, I would not describe that as very socially liberal. I would say, if anything, it was probably more socially conservative, but people weren't necessarily wearing veils. So it's more that like the way people kind of practice their religion has changed. So I think for a lot of women, it just became, they came to feel that to be a good Muslim woman, you had to wear a veil. And that they felt that that was part of the religion and they wanted to do that. So there was really a huge wave in the 90s of young women, especially well-educated young women, urban young women, adopting the veil. And that continues. And so, and I have a lot of friends who are very strong feminists, but also wear the veil. And they really they don't feel that it should be required. They're very much against that. They want people to be able to make the choice for themselves. But they do feel that for them, they believe in religion. They believe that, this is what God wants them to do. So I think that's what's changed is that, prior to the 90s, I think women tended to wear veils only for religious ceremonies, or if they had come back from the Hajj. It was sometimes like a symbol that you had done the Hajj. And it came to be seen as something that you were supposed to do as a Muslim woman.
So I was just curious. So I used to live in Saudi Arabia for 3 years, and when I was there, all the people I talked to, I mean, there's a lot of people from everywhere there, but especially a lot of Egyptians, they even had a similar feeling and like kind of thing that they were saying about the like the Muslima kind of thing that they were doing in the 80s and around the same time, maybe a little earlier. But do you have any idea, like, is it just the madrasas of Saudi Arabia? Is it like Sayyid Qutb? I don't know if you know, but I was just, something I've always wondered, like, why is there this kind of backlash wave of Islamization around the world?
Yeah, so there are a lot of reasons for that. I think Saudi Arabia looms large in that change, but also the Iranian Revolution. I think, I think those two things sort of coincide in interesting ways. Like the Iranian Revolution, came to be seen by many people around the world as a strike against American imperialism. Mm-hmm. So I think it really resonated in ways that Americans perhaps still don't fully understand throughout the world. And it wasn't necessary, and it was seen as Islamic in sort of a vague sense. And so it was this, for the first time, this sense of like third world people who are Muslims succeed in overthrowing American imperialism. So that kind of made Islam, I think, cool as like a discourse of rebellion, especially against American imperialism. So that's one thing. And then the second is that the oil boom brought in just massive amounts of money to Saudi Arabia. And they've used a lot of that money to fund religious schools and mosques around the world. And that has given Saudi Arabia in particular an outsized influence on how Islam is understood all over the world. And, you know, Indonesia has been a big recipient of Saudi funds. Now, it doesn't automatically mean just because, you know, the Saudis provided funding for some mosque, it doesn't necessarily mean that people suddenly adopt Saudi-style Islam.
Right.
And there's been a fair amount of resistance to that in Indonesia. And in fact, Indonesians talk about Arabization, right? And some Indonesians are very critical of what they see as efforts to Arabize or Wahhabize Islam. But, you know, I think there are subtle ways in which, you know, that funding, particularly for educational and religious institutions, was able to influence the way people understand Islam. Absolutely. Certainly also, I think another thing that happened was that starting in the 70s, a lot of Indonesians started getting scholarships to study in both in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt and in places like Syria. And I know there are a lot of Egyptian graduates. They tend to be, you know, that's a very prestigious scholarship. They tend to have a fairly moderate understanding of Islam. But the graduates, a number of the graduates from Saudi Arabian universities in particular in the 80s came back to Indonesia and started chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood and kind of brought that sort of, you know, style of Islamism to Indonesia.
Yeah.
And became, you know, some of them became very influential in the Islamist movement there. Then also the wars in Afghanistan in the 80s. You know, some of those Indonesians went to fight, you know, with the Islamists in Afghanistan and then, you know, returned to Indonesia. Those are usually the more sort of extreme folks.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. That's helpful.
Indonesian women they have the right to get divorced. I was wondering what they think about contraception and reproductive rights.
So Indonesia has actually been one of the world's biggest successes when it comes to family planning. So as recently as like the mid-1960s, Indonesian women on average had 7 children. So yeah, it was like huge population growth. It was really out of control. And what happened was essentially the government decided that it was in their national interest to bring down the population numbers. They didn't want to do what China was doing and adopt this really sort of authoritarian model. So they adopted a kind of more subtle model, and they got a bunch of, in Islam, contraception is not taboo. There are some interpretations of Islam that problematize contraceptions, but the mainstream ones are all fine with contraception. So they brought in a bunch of Islamic leaders and talked to them about this, and then created this big family planning program and used religious leaders very strategically to promote the idea that 2 is enough. And so that was a huge family planning program all over the country. They gave out free birth control with pills to women.
Wow.
And it was very successful, and they brought down the average number of children to now right about a little less than 2. So, you know, there's always been a little bit of resistance to that from, you know, the more socially conservative quarters, as there has been here, you know, so, but by and large, you know, the vast majority of people seem to be on board with that. So contraception is very sort of normal and accepted as a part of everyday life. The big issue with it is that you can't get contraception unless you're married. And so they do have, you know, a lot of issues with like teen pregnancy because teenagers often can't get a hold of contraception. So, you know, there's certainly some of that, but since it's still fairly taboo to have sex before marriage, it's certainly not at the sort of levels that we saw, you know, here in the US, you know, 15 or 20 years ago. In rural areas, people tend to get married much younger. You know, they're often getting married at, you know, 17 or 18. So that sort of makes the issue somewhat moot. Abortion is a much more difficult issue there. And although a lot of more sort of progressive Muslim theologians argue that abortion is actually permitted up to a certain point, usually in the first trimester, it has been illegal for a long time in Indonesia. But when I was doing my research, some of the Muslim feminists did succeed in getting a slight liberalization of the law. The law now, they changed it so that women who experience rape or incest can get an abortion, or, you know, if their life is in danger. But that's a continuing issue. And, you know, I know there are Muslim feminists who would like to see that opened up a little bit more to at least allow first trimester abortions. But it has been quite controversial. There's also a lot of opposition from Christians in Indonesia to abortion. So that makes it sort of a more complicated issue.
Yeah, the Catholics don't like that.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions?
Did you read all the questions that were submitted in the chat?
I think I did. Yeah.
Got through all those, yeah.
And if I didn't, please speak up and can ask the question. Rachel, did you want to let people know what you're researching right now?
Sure. So, you know, when the pandemic started happening, I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't going to be going back to Indonesia anytime soon. So I actually, and then I started seeing a lot of what was going on with gender in the US with the pandemic and started getting interested in that. So I got a little bit of funding to do a study on gender and families during the pandemic in the US. So I've been doing interviews with parents of young children in Boulder and Denver to really look at especially what's going on with like working moms and the kinds of tensions and burdens that they're experiencing. But interviewing, kind of trying to interview a wide variety of families. And I've also got a national survey going as well. So yeah, I just actually finished the first wave of interviews about a week ago and just getting started analyzing the data, and hopefully I'll be able to continue. It seems like this situation is not going to be ending soon. So
you'll have plenty of time to interview more people.
So I'll have plenty of time to do more interviews in the coming year.
And you could go back and re-interview.
Yes.
People to, yeah.
Sort of follow so that I can kind of like, one of the things I'm interested in, you know, getting a sense of is like, what is the impact on women's careers, you know, in particular, now that so many people have these extra burdens of remote schooling in particular and no childcare. Yeah.
Well, great. Good luck with that. And good luck with the start of the college season. I hope all that